America look the other way on the GOP's new election police. This larger issue, there's a difference between voter fraud and election fraud. Voter fraud is where individual voters try to do things that are fraudulent, like voting their dead spouse, or as that Republican did down in Georgia, or voting voting in two different states, as several Republicans did, voting for Donald Trump down in Florida when they also had homes in other states and they voted in those other states. That's voter fraud. There has never in my lifetime, I mean, it may well be that there were stuffed ballot boxes back in the 19th century that, but certainly in the years I've been on this planet, there has never been an election that has been altered as a result of voter fraud. So, it's really an inconsequential thing. But there is this thing called election fraud. And election fraud is where the mechanism of the election itself is rigged so that the outcome is essentially fraudulent. I mean, for example, consider in 1964, this is when the modern day Republican election fraud strategy began in 1964. And Democrats need to be calling it that, election fraud. In 1964, in Mississippi, 35.5% of all the citizens of Mississippi were black, yet only 4% had been able to successfully register to vote. In Alabama's 26% black, only 7% of Alabama black voters were registered to vote. In South Carolina, it was nearly 1/3 black, 29.2%. Only 9% of that state's African Americans could successfully register to vote. Alabama, 26% black, but the white power structure made sure that only 7% of African Americans in Alabama could vote. So how could you say that any election where only 4.3% of 35% of your citizens, more than a third of your citizens, only 4% of them were even allowed to vote, much less actually did, how could you call that a free and fair election? It's not. It's a fraudulent election. These were fraudulent elections that were being held in the 1960s, and the Republicans wanted to keep it that way. So in 1964, when Barry Goldwater was running against against Lyndon Johnson for president of the United States, the New York Times noted, now this is 1 week before the election. This is October 30th, 1964. I am reading to you from the New York Times. It's in my article. I quoted my article. Quote, Republican officials have begun a massive campaign to prevent vote fraud in the election next Tuesday, a move that has caused Democrats to themselves cry fraud. The Republican plan, Operation Eagle Eye, is designed, according to party officials, to prevent Democrats from, quote, stealing the 1964 election. Republicans charge that the election was stolen in 1960. The Democratic National Chairman, John M. Bailey, has criticized the Republican program as, quote, a program of voter intimidation, end quote. He has sent a protest to all 50 state governors and has alerted Democratic Party officials throughout the country to be on their guard. There is no doubt in my mind, Mr. Bailey wrote the state chairman yesterday, that this program is a serious threat to democracy as well as to the Democratic victory on November 3rd, 1964. Operation Eagle Eye was birthed in the 64 election by the Goldwater guys. William Rehnquist was running the Arizona branch of it. One reporter was, describing what happened. He said, Rehnquist knew the law and he applied it with the precision of a swordsman. He sat at the Bethune School, this is a polling place brimming with black citizens, and quizzed voters ad nauseum about where they were from, how long they'd lived there, every question in the book. And then a passage of the Constitution was read to them, and people were ordered to interpret it to prove they had the language skills necessary to vote. This is what happened in '64, the election police. Which brings us to today's news out of Florida, which is that this is from the Washington Post. Quote, Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is asking the GOP-controlled legislature to allocate nearly $6 million to hire 52 people to, quote, investigate, detect, apprehend, and arrest anyone for an alleged violation of election laws, end quote. They would be stationed at unspecified field offices throughout the state and act on tips from government officials or any other person, end quote. Right. Meanwhile, Common Cause leaked a document that in Harris County, the Republican, this is Houston, I believe, that the Republican officials are, quote, trying to, quote, build an army of 10,000 election workers and poll watchers, including some who will, quote, have the confidence and courage to go into black and brown communities to address alleged voter fraud that analyses show does not actually exist. That's what that was Jessica Corbett reporting for Common Dreams. In other words, they're mobilizing the militias. They're getting white volunteers to go into black and brown neighborhoods to try to intimidate people and try to do what William Rehnquist did in the original Operation Eagle Eye in 1964. This is election fraud. And the Republicans are not only committed to it, they have proposed hundreds of laws. They have passed over 100 of them in 19 states now to do just exactly this sort of thing. We need to be calling this out, and Democrats need to start screaming about election fraud. In fact, frankly, they should have been screaming about it ever since 1964, because the Republicans are committing election fraud and then covering it up by saying, oh, we're trying to stop voter fraud.